Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Data Playbook. Now that I've gone through the Sunday 1 o'clock games, I'm going to do the 4 o'clock games in the same format as before, so let's get to it. Our final matchup is Washington at Dallas, with Dallas being favored on the money line and a spread of 1.5 and a total line of 53.5 points. Washington has a pretty good rushing rank, second best in the league, and they're pretty good at scoring. They're not very good at stopping the pass game or stopping the rush game. They're also not great at passing. With Dallas over here, you have one of the top teams, offensively especially, with scoring, but they do allow a lot of scoring. They also have a good passing rank, but they allow a lot of passing. In fact, they're the worst team at stopping the pass. They're also very bad at stopping the rush, which explains why they allow so many points. But they have an average rushing rank too. And quickly show their averages. The Cowboys are the best at PPR scoring. They do have the most fantasy points in the league on average that they get, which is exceeding 105.5 fantasy points per game. So if you need some fantasy points, potentially look into the Cowboys if somebody's free. And of course, we're going to go through individual players so you can see if somebody's available who might be scoring a lot of points out there. Otherwise, here's your averages. Washington's just middle of the road with PPR scoring with 85.9, almost 86 fantasy points per game. Looking at the running backs in this game, you have Krosky, Merritt, and Williams. Williams getting almost 18.6 fantasy points per game on average in PPR, while Krosky Merritt gets almost 11 fantasy points in PPR. Jacory has had 2 turnovers this season, while Williams has had 1. If we switch over their averages, here you have that. And you have their week by week, with Javonte getting 135 rushing yards in 5, and Merritt also getting 111 rushing yards in week 5. And here's the top receivers. This will be an interesting game because you don't have Terry McLaurin, who's listed out, and Deebo Samuel, who's listed as out. So at this point, your number one receiver is Luke McCaffrey. And over here, you have CeeDee Lamb returning, who had a pretty good start to the season, as we can see in the 2 weeks, but it's only been 2 weeks. So it'll be interesting to see what he does when he comes back here. In the time that he's played, he gets 19.1 average fantasy points in PPR per game, while Luke McCaffrey gets 7.6 average fantasy points per game. If I flip these over to the averages, these are their average yards per game, with CeeDee Lamb being very high at 111, 110, 112 for the 2 weeks that he did play. Otherwise, you can break down Luke McCaffrey's weeks, week 1 being a very bad one. If you look at their percentages, Luke McCaffrey gets about 12.5% of the team's receiving share. Inevitably, that will go up because without Terry McLaurin and Deebo Samuel, you won't have them competing. With CeeDee Lamb, you only get about 17% of the air receiving share. That is kind of small, but that's because he's been out, with all these yards. So expect that to grow as he gets more integrated back into the system. I think this 32% is George Pickens, so let's take a look at that. And just looking at George Pickens, because we don't really have anybody else from Washington, I could go down the list and look at some people, but I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of information from them. So we'll just look at Pickens and move on. But Pickens does get almost 20 fantasy points in PPR per game, which is pretty impressive. I mean, he's been filling in for CeeDee Lamb, so he's been taking that share where he gets the 32.7% share of the receiving yards. I do expect that to shrink as CeeDee Lamb comes back in, but right now he's the top receiver. If you want to see the breakdown, here it is, especially last week with 168 yards. And just showing the averages here if they think that's useful for you. And wrapping up with the tight ends, you have Zach Ertz and Jake Ferguson. Ferguson's been an interesting story since he's had something like 15 games without a touchdown, and then he broke that streak this year. I think a similar story happened with Kincaid, so it's been fascinating to see him change this season. He does get an average of 16.4 fantasy points in PPR per game, while Zach Ertz only gets a little less than 10 average fantasy points in PPR per game. If I flip over the averages, there you have them if you want to look at them, and the breakdown week by week. Looking at their share of receiving yards, you get about 12.5% of the share of receiving yards for Jake Ferguson, and you get a little bit more of that with Zach Ertz. I think that's, unfortunately, again, the number doesn't show up, but I think it's probably closer to that, like similar to this, 17%, maybe 16% receiving share. So this will be an interesting game to watch. It will be interesting to see how Washington does without their top 2 receivers. However, they're much better at rushing against a team that's not very good at stopping the rush. So, we may see that back and forth. Again, a lot of allowed passing from Washington and a lot of passing from the Cowboys. So expect the Cowboys to throw it a bunch. Expect Washington to run it a bunch is what I would come out with these numbers. And there's your data for that game. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, leave a like and subscribe to see more, and leave a comment on what else you might want to see in the future. But otherwise, I'll see you next time.